So this is the last panel of the conference. And so for some of you who've been wondering, what does a conference like this have anything to do with a graduate policy school? This is where we pull it all together. This is where we move, as we say in the title of this, from theory into practice. But at the same time, I know from our conference calls that we've had with the panelists, there's also going to be some discussion around politics in this. It's not simply going to be about policy and policy prescriptions, but how we talk about them. And so it's great to be joined once again by another terrific and diverse panel. Let me introduce them first before we get into what will be a more of a conversational format around the subject. To my left is Rachel Barkley. Rachel is the Director of Outreach for the House Republican Conference in the U.S. House. To her left is Dr. Lonnie Chen, the David and Diane Steffi Research Fellow at the Hoover Institution, and very importantly, a past William E. Simon Visiting Professor here at the Graduate Policy School. To his left is Tony Mills. Tony is the Managing Editor of the very important website Real Clear Policy, part of the Real Clear media empire. If you haven't looked into that as a source, I heartily encourage you to check out realclearpolitics.com, realclearpolicy.com, really a terrific aggregator of news and views from across the political spectrum. To Tony's left is Dr. Ryan Streeter. Ryan is the Director of the Domestic Policy Studies Group within the American Enterprise Institute. And to Ryan's left is Robert Trainum, who's head of public policy communications for Facebook, but also brings quite a bit of DC political experience, which we might get into. I was struck by that last comment by my friend Steve Greenhut talking about some of the challenges that Republicans are facing that really have nothing to do with policy and have everything to do with politics. And so maybe as a way of beginning, I know we've allotted just a couple minutes for each of you to talk about your connection to conservative policy. And so Rachel, I want to start with you. We were talking on the call thinking about strategy and how policy is communicated. We had talked on the call about the issue and challenge that Republicans seem to face around grand bargains, which if there's anything that we've been discussing throughout the panels is thinking about conservatism not only as a specific set of policy prescriptions or views of the world, but also as a way of engaging with politics. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that from your experience on the Hill.
Absolutely. Thanks, Pete. Thanks for having me here. I really just think that the conversations we're having are so important. On the flight here, I was reading a book called The Iron Curtain, The Crushing of Eastern Europe. Now, you thought I couldn't get more depressing than the loneliness and suicide talk earlier. And what really struck me about my grandmother fled Soviet-occupied Lithuania, and it's a lot of the reason why I do what I do, because I have her stories about communism versus freedom that we have here as part of my family story. And just the obvious in every single country that the Soviet Union occupied, the systematic destruction of the institutions that make civil society strong was a trend in every single country. And so as we're talking about institutions, this is an existential threat that we save these institutions that are part of our civil society, because as soon as those institutions, in Eastern Europe, it was the Boy Scouts, the churches, the civic groups, as soon as those leave, then totalitarianism comes in. And so the tactics that Pete's talking about, I think, are so important to this because we cannot afford to make tactical mistakes that put us down that road. So I know a lot of you, how many of you watch the news and you say, I am so frustrated. When is Congress going to get something done? How many of you feel that way? Well, I've got some numbers for you that might shock you. The House of Representatives, the Republican Congress, has passed 768 bills. How many of you knew that? 768 bills. 186 of those have been signed into law. 564 of those are waiting in the Senate. So those are just some numbers, some perspective. The House has actually passed a large number of bills, and some pretty big ones. You know, we passed a repeal and replace of Obamacare that didn't make it through the Senate with one thumbs down vote. We did Dodd-Frank reform. We've done 56 bills on opioids that have a good trajectory, fixing the opioid crisis. There are a large number of big problems that we've solved in pieces of legislation that either have been signed into law, have stalled in the Senate, or kind of different parts of the legislative process. So you look at this and you say, well, actually, the numbers bear out. These members of Congress aren't lazy, right? How many of you have worked in Congress before? You know that congressional staff and members of Congress are actually some of the hardest working people who work crazy long hours. So it's not that they're lazy. It's not that things aren't moving or can move. So you look at that and say, is it really a process problem? I know a lot of conservatives like to say, well, if only our processes were better, if only we had budget process reform, then we could get all the things we really wanted. And what I want to pose to you all is that it's really more of a political will problem and understanding what we're working with to be statesmen and move and legislate. So what do I say when it's a political will problem? If I just said members of Congress aren't lazy and the staff aren't lazy, but we have a political will problem, what does that mean? Was talking last night with Henry Olson about his theory about the four faces of the Republican Party. That really the Republican Party isn't this one monolithic group that believes in all of the same things. We're now dealing with a very diverse group of Republican constituents who elected their leaders for very different reasons that don't all believe the same thing. So if we look at the reality of who these different members of Congress represent and why they voted them in, they have kind of some different opposed views. And when we're getting these big, hefty pieces of legislation, if you're looking at these hundreds of pages long bills, such as Obamacare repeal and replace and comprehensive immigration reform, I think there's a lot of frustration by people that say, why can't we move these massive pieces of legislation? We're at this unique point where we have a Republican president, Republican Congress, Republican Senate. These big pieces of legislation, we should be able to overhaul it all. But I would pose to you that this mentality of all or nothing, we got to get big passages across, big bills passed, is not getting us where we want to be with results. And that really, perhaps the more prudent approach would be a mode of incrementalism. And this is not a dirty word. I think a lot of conservatives look at tactically incrementalism as selling out or as moderate or as squishy. But I want to, on this topic, kind of leave you with a quote from Winston Churchill. A statesman is like a good captain, throwing his weight to either side of a ship as necessary to keep it ever on the true course. So if he didn't think incrementalism was a dirty word, I don't think we should either. So Pete, I don't know if you want me to stop
we're
there.
going to come back because actually where you just are ties very neatly into bringing Lonnie in on this, because I think part of this conversation is not going to be just about specific policy prescriptions, but also how policy is created. And it seems in a world of hyperpartisanship and polarization that the swings that we see in our political discourse, that things swang one way, so for the conservatives now to be demanding grand bargains on the other side just seems to run against foundational conservative principles of deliberation and how policy decisions are made. So I want to bring you in, Lonnie, on this as well, and because what we talked about in our prep call for this was how we have swung from a time of executive authority. I've got a pen and a phone. We had a previous president once say, I think we all have pens and phones, don't we? Pretty much. But how now that the shoe is on the other foot, so to speak, the conservatives who were once, or maybe Republicans, and that's another part of this conversation, who were very angry about that perceived abuse of executive authority are now very supportive of a president who is using some of those same measures. And I wonder, looking at the executive and how we understand that executive authority as a conservative needs to be a part of this conversation as well.
Yeah, well, it absolutely does. And well, first of all, Pete, thanks for putting this all together. This is a great gathering, and it's always great to be back here at such a beautiful venue. So I think you're absolutely right. I think one of the problems we've run into as conservatives is that we feel the need to have everything or nothing, all at once or never at all. And that's the allure of executive action, right? The allure of executive action is I can do this right now, right away, with my pen and my phone. I can write something that may not conceptually make a lot of sense in the future, but makes a lot of sense for now. And I think that the expansion of the administrative state certainly did not begin with Donald Trump. You can make an argument that it expanded significantly under Barack Obama, that President Obama's use of multiple forms of executive action to circumvent the Congress was really the start of a lot of what we're seeing today. So one of the arguments that my friends from the Obama administration are fond of making is say, well, President Obama actually didn't sign that many executive orders. And they're right as a matter of course with respect to the executive order. But what they ignore is that President Obama used a multitude of executive actions to promulgate his agenda. So the presidential memorandum, which is a understudied element of the exercise of executive authority, was something that he used more readily and more quickly than any other president in modern history. And by the way, the only difference between the memorandum and the executive order has to do with the measure of publication in the Federal Register. Who knew that? Who cares, right? Because President Obama figured out, I have a very easy way of doing what I want to do, and I can still make the argument I'm not actually using the executive order, and I can still get what I want. So there were all these things he did. He used something known as informal agency guidance, where he would tell an agency essentially, here's what I would like you to do. The whole DACA program is actually not an executive order. It is not even a presidential memorandum. It is guidance that was given to then Secretary Napolitano to develop a program to keep people who were brought here as undocumented immigrants when they were kids to allow them to stay here. So this is all to say that I think during the Obama years, we as conservatives were very quick to criticize the president when he used executive action, and for good reason, because he was circumventing what the policy-making process was intended to be. The policy-making process is intended to be deliberate. It is intended to go through Congress in a deliberative fashion, for the people's representatives to be able to have a say on what they believe, and for them to reflect the will of those who elected them to the Congress. And you know, President Obama was notoriously impatient, and so he developed a process where it was okay. And now, you know, the shoe is on the other foot. And conservatives are complaining less about the process because we like the outcome. And I think that's a very dangerous place to be, because there may not be a Republican president, hate to say it, there may not be a Republican president or a conservative president in a few years, and then what happens?
Right.
Then you've legitimized a process that uses administrative action to achieve the same ends that the policy-making process was intended for. And so I guess I would sound a cautionary note about the use of executive action and the overuse, particularly of executive authority, which has become commonplace because we seem to be in a place now where we feel like, well, look, if Congress doesn't give us what we want, then it's just very easy to use this process. And we have a midterm election coming up. And if the midterm election does not go well, particularly in the House, I think in the Senate, you know, hopefully will be okay. In the House, you know, it's a little bit more competitive. Then what happens then, right? Are we in a position where if President Trump needs to get stuff done in his last 2 years, he's going to again go to executive action? And I would just caution us as conservatives to remember that that is not, I think, the way the founders intended for policy to be made, and it's a very dangerous road to be traveling down.
Thank you. Tony, let's stay in D.C. then. A place a long way away from here. I don't know if any of you recognize why we're doing it here. Maybe a little bit contrary to Rachel's point about some of the procedural fixes or reforms that Rachel positions more in a greater cultural moment that we're in. Some of the work that you've been doing at Real Clear Policy around the administrative state and its connection to Congress and congressional oversight has been around looking at possible reforms in ways that would certainly comport with this conversation around a conservatism of connection. Tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing there.
Sure, and I want to start by thanking you, Pete, for the invitation. It's wonderful to be here. It's my first time to the Pepperdine campus, so it's beautiful.
Not the last time.
I hope not. Yeah, so as Pete, you mentioned, I'm the managing editor at Real Clear Media, where I focus in particular on policy. But my background by training, I'm a philosopher. So when I was invited to be on a panel about theory to practice, part of me found that somewhat amusing, since practice is not always the forte of people trained in philosophy. But I actually think that part of my approach to these questions, these practical questions about policy, is deeply informed by philosophy. And one of the things that I've really found gratifying about this conference is sort of a productive tension between the level of theory and philosophy and very concrete issues of policy and campaigning and very nuts and bolts practical aspects of politics. And so part of my view on this set of issues is related to that theme of thinking about first principles and their practical implications. And I think that my view on this is maybe superficially somewhat different than Rachel's, but I think ultimately is convergent. So there's been one of the themes of this conference has been the importance of localism and reinvigorating civil society and intermediary institutions and so on. And I'm typically in the position of defending that point of view myself, but I'm going to take the unenviable task of making a different kind of argument, which is that I think in order for that kind of politics to be possible, we also have to be able to make a positive case for reinvesting and reforming our national institutions, and in particular Congress. And the reason I say that is really, there are three reasons that I say that. The first has to do with the administrative state and what Lonnie was talking about. It seems to me that one of the primary obstacles to this kind of conservatism of connection, insofar as it takes root in the face-to-face communities as the locus of democracy, one of the primary obstacles is the administrative state. The fact that we've delegated a lot of lawmaking power and even the enforcement of a lot of law to a bureaucratic apparatus that's in Washington. And that the cause of the dissolution of a lot of these intermediary institutions is related to the growth of that. Agencies that began with a purpose of supplementing and ultimately, in some cases, explicitly replacing civil institutions from the state government down to the family. And so any attempt to reinvigorate the civil society, while it will have to involve a kind of bottom-up reinvestment in local communities, will have to also involve a top-down reform, deconstruction, to use Steve Bannon's language, something at the highest level there. And I'm not naive in thinking that will be easy to do, but I think it's necessary. So this would be a sort of complement to the more localist emphasis. But the second reason I think that this is necessary is that Congress, Lonnie mentioned something to this effect, Congress is the Constitution's first branch. It is the primary, it's the cord that connects the citizenry to the federal government. That used to be connected a little bit differently, especially when senators were appointed by the state legislatures, but it's still the case. And I think the unpopularity of Congress has driven a lot of the resentment towards government, feeling of political alienation. And in order to have a kind of repoliticization, to use a language more popular on the left, that begins in the local communities, I think it's necessary to come to an agreement about how to make Congress in particular function the way it's supposed to. I think a distinction here that can be helpful is one that Senator Ben Sass sometimes makes between small and limited government. The question of small government is, how much money do we want to spend? How much do we want to be involved in this particular domain, education, or do we want to cut Social Security or reform it? Limited government is a constitutional matter. And the problem that we have now is, to my mind, is that the conflation of those things has led us to be unable to make the positive case for what limited functions government at the federal level should be doing. And I think the consequence of that is this sort of feeling of helplessness among a lot of the electorate. And so the third piece is that I think that these are the circumstances in which Donald Trump was elected. I think that what Trump has shown is the power, was first of all the need for an adequate conception of political community for any viable politics. The right was not providing that, and Donald Trump provided it in the form of some kind of nationalism. I think that to move forward in that context, it will be necessary to offer nationalism rightly understood, as the American Project document says it. And a way to think about that is in terms of these the principles that we have from our constitutional patrimony, that for instance, the Madisonian understanding of the federal government. So that while we may think of nationalism as first engaging our local community, we also have to think about ways at the national level we can understand ourselves as citizens of a common republic. And I think Congress there is absolutely central. And so the reason so I think it sort of brings a lot of these threads together. To my mind, the reason why Congress is relevant to the administrative state is that I think if you look at the story, the long picture, it's this weakening of Congress that has allowed the administrative state to grow. And there's a whole story that can be told about that. And I think it's similar with this issue of nationalism. Politics abhors a vacuum, and we may want the civil and intermediary institutions to fill the void, but in order for that to happen, I think we have to put our efforts on reforming our national institutions first.
We will come back to that point about how we discuss government, because I think sometimes, as a couple people have told me, one of the ironies of this panel, and even the thought that we might be considered a conservative graduate school of public policy, is that the rhetoric on the right is so much about demeaning government as an institution. So how do we even have a conversation about it? And obviously that's one of the themes that I want to get into here. That actually, your comments, Tony, thank you, naturally transition then to you, Ryan, who's been doing so much great writing and thinking and speaking on the importance of localism. You're based obviously at a major conservative think tank, doing a lot of work in DC, but tell us a little bit about the connection between some of these issues and how conservatives can be thinking from a policy standpoint about a more vibrant localism.
Sure, thanks, Pete, and thanks to you and Rich for putting together a really great couple days of conversations. It's refreshing and fun to be back at Pepperdine. I think that policy making right now is beset by what I call the great social science paradox, and that is that we know a lot more now than we did 25 years ago about the importance of social and personal connections in people's overall well-being. We actually knew a lot then. We know a lot more now about the way in which the number of friends that you have, the number of contacts you have, the number of people that you're engaged with on a regular basis actually have real benefits in your life. What kinds of benefits? Better college placement levels, higher wages, better jobs actually than people that look for jobs through Monster.com or Indeed.com, et cetera. Less chance of interfacing with the criminal justice system, better happiness. All these things are directly related to, and many times flow from, the depth, quality, and richness of the social networks in which we're embedded. And yet, we do almost nothing in our policymaking deliberation to consider those realities. We actually did a better job 25 years ago when we knew a lot less. And like I said, we knew a lot then. James Q. Wilson, I'll mention him just because of his affiliation here with Pepperdine. He actually said back then, over 20 years ago, the social science on the importance of relationships and social capital is so persuasive that even some sociologists now believe it. And now we know a lot more, and yet we don't do a whole lot with it in our policy making. I'll come back to the policy side of this in a minute, but I want to make this point because of the nature of the discussions we've been having over the last couple of days about polarization, identity politics, and tribalism. I think this is important for us to understand precisely for these reasons, and I actually think that the thing that's most damaging to our civic fabric and our political discourse these days is abstract tribalism. And I think we had a debate yesterday about the nature of identity politics, and I think if you have an ethnic or racial identity and it's rooted in a community with norms, practices, habits, cultural mores that are attached to your race or ethnicity or your gender, those are not necessarily going to be bad things or divisive things. What tends to be tearing us apart is this abstract tribalism. And I think back to an essay that David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, wrote in 1752 when he talked about parties of principle. And he said this is a new thing in modern politics in mid-18th century. He said we used to have political parties that were focused on interests. You know, if you're in a shipping town, your politics are going to be driven very much by trade policy. If you're out in the country, very much by agricultural policy. But in this day, we have these parties of principle. And he didn't have terms like ideology back then. But he was talking about people getting really, really feverish. This febrile tendency that we have over these abstract principles. Think in today's terms about climate change or inequality or lower taxes if you're a conservative. It's hard to get young people out to the mall for fix our roads, fix our roads, fix our roads. When in fact that matters a lot when you're driving along, you've got lousy infrastructure, you have a lot of it in California, and people are like, I'm going to have to fix that tire again, and you complain about it. But you'll turn out in droves to fight inequality, even though you can't tangibly return to your community and fight inequality in any meaningful way. And yet, this is what drives us to great feverish politics. And yet, let me put it this way: I'm half Dutch. Okay, my mom's family's from Grand Rapids, Michigan. The Streeters, 13 generations. Who knows what's in the Streeter? We don't know. I haven't done the 23andMe thing, but I know that I'm half Dutch. Everyone on that side of the family. The Streeters are distinguished by a long history of doing nothing but not distinguishing themselves. But the Dutch side of my family is 100% that. Now, I don't. If I was walking around in wooden shoes and building, irrigation ditches in my backyard and dikes to keep the floods out, it would kind of freak the neighbors out if I was trying to somehow behave Dutch. I'm not in any meaningful way a Dutch person. Like that identity, I could try to go back and be like the weirdos in the 23andMe commercials who discover that, oh, I'm not German, I'm Scottish, and now I have a kilt and a bagpipe and all that. And forgive me if you've done that, but that's pathetic, actually. If now all of a sudden you're into Scotland because you discovered you have some Scottish blood. Meanwhile, I'm still a father. I'm still involved in my kids' schools, or was. They're now getting older. But I'm a member of my church. I'm actually in a district of a city that I care about. And we've moved around a lot. The Streeters, this household, the Streeters have. We've moved around a lot, but we've found a meaningful role in each of the communities we've lived, and it's important your schools have a strong organizing principle on your lives, your family, your broader community, and this is actually where our most important identities are realized. And I'll come back to this notion of geography here in just a second, because I think it's important when we think about policymaking and the role of social networks. The point I'm making is that human scale in our human lives is a really important concept, and that is when we participate in the institutions of public life in ways where we can have a strong sense of belonging and where we can exercise some influence. This is where these are the most important places for us to be. That's where our identity effectively matters the most when it comes to solving problems that we say are ills in our society. When I worked for the mayor of Indianapolis, Steve Goldsmith, back in the 1990s, and he had a neighborhood-based initiative where there was funding given to distinct neighborhoods that were all low-income neighborhoods beset by all the problems that you would think: bad schools, high crime rates, high out-of-wedlock childbearing, all those things. Named the neighborhoods, they had strong identities, and over the course of 8 years, used resources to pursue initiatives that came from those communities. And we studied all this, wrote it up. It's in a book. You can see it, where you saw amazing drops in all those negative indicators and rises in positive indicators, because people had a sense that this forgotten part of town, it was now a district with an actual name. And if you're from a big city and you're talking to someone else from your city and they ask you where you're from, you don't say, I'm from Manhattan. You'll say, I'm from Chelsea, or I'm from Tribeca, or I'm from... And if you're in Atlanta, you're going to say, I'm from Virginia Highlands, or I'm from the Druid Hills area, or whatever. You're going to talk about the district where you're from, because your identity is built up in that. And that actually has really important public policy applications, I think. I think the mayor of St. Petersburg, Florida, I forget his name, a few years back, that was an initiative of his, and he went around and they basically named all of the districts in the city, and they bought the signs, and they created that sense of identity out of this realization that this matters. G.K. Chesterton said, in order to have true patriotism for your country, every family should have their own flag. And the idea is you learn those habits of citizenship at home. We actually took that to heart in the Streeter family. We made our own family crest, and many of you have older children now, but anyone who has younger kids, I highly recommend it to actually try to put that into practice. But it's the human scale that matters, that institutions where you can both belong and have influence, I think matter when it comes to doing our public policy right. And that's different than saying that localism is kind of the end all. So what I'm cautioning us against today is, on the one hand, a move towards abstract tribalism, which seems to really have infected our politics, and particularly for younger people getting involved in politics. That's the biggest danger right now, is to attach your identity to an abstract cause in which you honestly can't really do much to affect the outcomes of that cause. So abstract tribalism on the one hand, but then a nostalgia for localism on the other hand. Some localities in America are really terrible places. And if you're living in that terrible place, it's probably better for you. And feel free, we can argue about this later on, but it's probably better for you to find your human scale belonging in a community across town with richer networks of social capital, where the schools are better. And we've seen this now. This has been demonstrated in social science experiments, where when young people move from a terrible locality into a better locality, even if they come from a single-parent household with all the indicators of future failure, if they live long enough in a community where most of the households are intact and most of the schools are good and there's strong volunteerism and people are engaged in their communities, their outcomes are much more like the kids from that neighborhood than the one that they came from. So the question is, can we help create more of a human scale sense of belonging and sense of responsibility in people's lives, no matter where they are? And I think that's where we look to some places where we've succeeded before in this regard. I think that the 1990s, when we actually knew a lot less about social networks, was sort of an interesting decade when a lot of these types of things in domestic policy in America were experimented with. The most famous one being welfare reform, where people had to work. That's what got all the headlines. But what really actually made that work was states and localities had to start taking responsibility for people who were multi-generational welfare recipients and who now had to find jobs. And didn't know anybody who had in their household who had actually worked. They needed to actually get help doing that. And so partnerships formed between community organizations and employers all across the country in a decentralized way, and it was a success. That was also the decade of school reform. The charter school movement started to take off then. We started to see more diversity in K through 12 education. Community policing, James Q. Wilson and George Kelling, broken windows theory, get the police out of the police cars, have them walk the neighborhoods, get to know the residents, build relationships with community institutions. Hope 6, tore down public housing, gave people vouchers, moved them into better neighborhoods, mixed income development. These things all happened over a brief span of time. And if you go back and look at like the contract with America in 1994, you'll actually see a lot of these notions of neighborhood, community, family, safety at the local level presupposed in those policy directions. Listen to the rhetoric of the Tea Party crowd, many of whom I love, many of whom I actually know, many of whom I've supported, but listen to the Tea Party crowd. These notions of community-based solutions to problems, the fact that we should devolve more authority to the local level, that we ought to actually invest more responsibility at the local level in the way we do those policies, is pretty much devoid. We're going to go to Washington and we're going to fix what's wrong with it. That's been a rhetoric now that's been pretty prevalent on the right, and I think to the detriment of good policy and particularly policy outcomes at the local level. So I'm happy to talk a little bit more about, specifically on some policy issues, how we might implement that, but I've talked long enough and I'll pass the baton.
Well, and I want to just, I hadn't thought about this when we were having our prep call, Ryan, but, you're talking about the history of this policy and the fact that 25 years ago or so, there was actually a lot more vibrant research and policy making happening around this, especially that wasn't necessarily on the right, but was coming from the right by and large. And it might be something we introduce into the conversation here, but I wonder if in some ways 9/11 nationalized us in such a way that we lost track of that.
Yeah, it's a good point.
There are so, as someone who was in New York on 9/11, there were so many repercussions of that from a policy perspective and also a cultural and political perspective. I wonder if we've really taken a full account of that. And I wonder now that we're 17 coming up on 18 years out, 17 coming up on 17 years out from that, whether the time has finally come to look back and reclaim those conversations that were happening with the Goldsmiths, and obviously you involved in that, and others around how we think anew about more of a localism, locally driven public policy. On that light note, we will turn to Robert Trainum. Robert, I thought what was so great about your background and having you on this panel is that you span both politics and the private sector, and I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about how your understanding of conservative public policy, especially as it relates to business and markets, especially your work at Facebook, might flavor this conversation. So please just give us a few minutes of your thoughts on the topic.
Sure. Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks, Pete, and special thanks to Rich as well. I guess I have the benefit of going last, and I will be brief so that we can have enough time for questions. I want to go back on something you said a few moments ago because it's weaving into what I was going to say in my prepared remarks. You mentioned 9/11 in terms of the nationalism, if you will. We had another thing called December 7th, 1941, when we all became nationalized, if you will. And it's really interesting when it came to public policy back then, because I'm sure none of you were alive. I certainly wasn't alive back then. But from what I remember from the history books was virtually 87% of the American public back in 1940, 1941 did not want to go into war. German Americans were German Americans, Italian Americans were Italian Americans. This localism, if you will, was very much dominant in our society back then. But then obviously, in the morning of December 7th, 1941, when Pearl Harbor was attacked, we all became Americans. And so Italian Americans went into the army and fought against fascist Italy. German Americans obviously went into the army and fought against Nazism. And so we weren't just, obviously I'm not speaking on behalf of myself because folks that look like me weren't welcome in the armed forces at that time in a true sense. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that there was this sense of nationalism after a really, really prolonged period of tribalism in many, many ways. And so what's really interesting about my background, so I've spent 10 years working in the United States Senate. I worked in the Senate Republican Conference. I worked for a person by the name of Rick Santorum as his Deputy Chief of Staff, Communications Director. Worked in the White House in 2004 for President Bush's reelect. I now work for Facebook. So it's a really interesting life that I live in terms of the public policy life in conservative circles, but also, quite frankly, the tech industry when it comes to big data and privacy and so forth. What's really interesting about this time, I think, and I'm going to throw out two controversial things. I know we're limited on time, and I would welcome a lot of questions around this, is that I firmly believe that in reading the Constitution, that Congress is a co-equal branch of government, right? We have three branches, the judicial, executive, and legislative. Congress has made itself impotent. Congress has made itself irrelevant in many, many ways. Here's why. If you take a look at, which I was a very strong supporter of and helped campaign on this in 1994, when you read the Contract of America, there are a lot of things in there that we supported back then that really, really made Congress impotent fast forward to today. Prime example of that, the elimination of earmarks. So I know that's a very controversial topic, and for those of you who know the earmark process, members of Congress who were on the Appropriations Committee prior to 1994 were actually pretty powerful. Were extremely powerful in the tug of war going back and forth with the executive branch in terms of Robert C. Byrd wanting this space station or these paved roads in West Virginia, or perhaps someone else, no-name member of Congress who was on the Appropriations Committee, going back to the White House and saying, well, maybe, Mr. President, if you want my vote on this, then you're going to have to get this in my district. And so there was this natural tug of war back and forth that I believe Congress has pretty much been submissive to the executive branch. That's Congress's fault. I don't believe that's President Bush's fault or President Obama's fault or President Trump's fault. Quite frankly, any strong chief executive is going to seize a weakness and use it to their advantage. Another thing that President Obama did very skillfully is that he just didn't enforce the law. He just simply ignored it. And I'm not suggesting that that's a good thing, but I am saying that if in fact you have a Congress that's going to look the other way, that is something that I think we need to really take a look at. The other thing that I think is slightly controversial, but I believe in this, is that Congress let itself open to a lot of sunlight. And what do I mean by that? Well, look, when you let C-SPAN into the Senate floor and the House floor back in 1979 and 1981, when you allow the committee process to be taped and recorded from gavel to gavel, you act differently because clearly your constituents are watching and clearly you are going to do things that you're probably not going to do when that little red light is off. Let me give an example. So back in 1998, when I was in the United States Senate, Bill Clinton was being impeached, literally and figuratively. And as you probably remember back then, the United States Senate trial was literally broadcast on all of the networks at the time. So basically from about 9 in the morning until about 11:45, broadcast live, I was in the back of the Senate floor as a staffer taking notes for my boss. And most members of the United States Senate, and even the impeachment managers back then, Henry Hyde, Roy Brocker, and so forth, acted a certain way in front of the camera. Very, very, very professional, talking about, obviously, the Starr Report, talking about Monica Lewinsky and so forth. And then when Senator Lott said, okay, folks, we're going to take a break, the cameras would go off, the senators would go for lunch, completely different conversation was happening. But as soon as that camera went back on, the members of Congress were acting, literally and figuratively, in terms of the camera. And so what I'm saying here, ladies and gentlemen, is that there has been an erosion, and I respectfully disagree with one of my colleagues a few moments ago when they said that it was, we as Republicans have always attacked government. That's partially true. But we've never, up until this point, attacked the fundamental democracy or pillars of democracy. We've always attacked the size of government, rightfully so. We've always attacked, or at least questioned, the role of government. That's a legitimate conversation to have. But when we're having a hair on fire conversation about the fundamentals of democracy and the role of government with respect to supporting these democracy or these pillars of democracy, I think that's where we're in trouble. And so what I'm respectfully asking is that we have a conversation about perhaps maybe closing the blinds a little bit and not letting as much sunlight come in to allow members of Congress the breathing room to work behind the scenes, yes, I am saying that, to literally compromise, yes, I am saying that, not give up their principles, but at least go back and forth in a private way so they're not going to be penalized when they go on Facebook Live or when they turn on the news and see that their words are being twisted up. So I work for Facebook, and I'll pause here because I know that could cause a lot of emotion in people. And one of the things that we pride ourselves on doing is connecting people. Regardless of what you believe, regardless of what your background is, if in fact you have a strong belief, and perhaps maybe you are a gay Republican and you're in Iowa and there's no one around you that looks like you or that acts like you or that thinks like you, you can, in theory, connect with someone that is just like you in China. Well, maybe China's not the best example, but in Pennsylvania or Germany, whatever the case may be. What we do is we connect people in a way, in a true, authentic way. Now, there's no question about it that there is obviously a lot of turbulence and a lot of bumps. I'm sure a lot of you in this room are probably thinking that we have a conservative bias when it comes to our algorithms. I'm sure a lot of people have some thoughts and concerns about privacy and about data. Those are legitimate concerns. But the fundamental thing that we do, and I think most tech companies do this, is that we're trying to figure out a way to make life better. We're trying to figure out a way to make life a little bit simpler. So, and there are thousands of examples of us doing that. Two examples, one in a good way, one in a bad way. So a good example is, some of you have heard of Races. This is the nonprofit organization on Facebook that set out to raise $1,500 on Facebook. I just checked about 20 minutes ago before this panel, they raised $20 million, all on Facebook, all virtual. So this, in the donations, on average of about $7 a piece, from Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, Independents alike. People that feel very strong, and by the way, from all 50 states. And these are people that feel very strongly about what they're hearing about allegedly people being locked up in cages and so forth. So that's a good example of how we're connecting people. Another thing that we take very, very seriously, which I think touches upon the last panel, is the sense of well-being and the sense of connectivity and the sense that most people are tethered to their phones. I'll pause on these statistics that I think some of you may know, but just a friendly reminder. 1941, when we are just on the eve of going into World War II, how many of you want to take a guess as to what the average attention span of an American was back then? 5 minutes, 5 seconds, 20 seconds? Anyone want to take a guess? Anyone else? So roughly about 4 minutes. So for 4 minutes, in theory, you could stand in the bank line, you can stand in the grocery store, you could perhaps stand at the library and just wait your turn for about 4 minutes and not get antsy. Fast, and by the way, that was really before television, so there's a correlation there. That was the rise of radio. Fast forward to 1960, you have the rise of radio. You have the rise of a very telegenic president in John F. Kennedy, who speaks in succinct sound bites and so forth. Anyone want to take a guess what the average attention span was back in 1960 on average? 2 minutes. 2 minutes? A minute? 10 minutes? Okay. Went down to about 2 minutes. Fast forward another 20 years to 1980, you have another telegenic president in Ronald Reagan. Anyone want to take a guess as what the attention span was on average back in 1980? 20 seconds? I heard a minute. Anyone else? About a minute and a half. So fast forward to today, well, 2016 when this study was done. Anyone want to take a guess as to what the average attention span for an American is 2016 to present, 2018? 7 seconds, 9 seconds. Okay, so it's 8 seconds. Does anyone want to take a guess as to what, and this is according to a study that was done, anyone would like to take a guess in terms of what an average attention span of a goldfish is? 9 seconds. So what I'm saying, ladies and gentlemen, is over the last 78 years or so, the average attention of American is shorter than a goldfish. And so that's a good thing and a bad thing, right? So the good thing about that is that we're able to multitask much more frequently now. We get much more information much, much quicker than we ever have. And we are obviously a society that is extremely connected and able, using this, to donate $25 million in 25 seconds if in fact we want to. The downside to this is that when you apply that to policy, is that more and more people feel connected to their government, but not in an authentic way. Not in an authentic way. And we know this because of all the fake news. We know this based on the rise of partisan rankering back and forth. We know this because I am fortunate enough to be on MSNBC sometimes, and when I get recognized, some people will say, well, Robert, you don't know what you're talking about. You often talk about where there's 3 branches of government. I said, well, there is. That's an undeniable fact that there's 3 branches of government. I had this conversation last month in the Atlanta airport where someone literally was yelling at me and said that it was 4 branches of government, and she pulled up a website that legitimately looked like a legitimate newspaper website, no disrespect to any of the publications here. And I said, ma'am, with all due respect, that's not true. That is just not true.
That was not real clear. Let's just be
but she pretty indignantly, if that's a word, said to me, yes, it is true. So there's a fundamental difference and disconnect between what we believe is true and how connected we feel to our government when it's really not true. And I think that's something that, and what I'm arguing is that, and my thesis is, in closing in this, is that a little less sunlight, and I think a little bit more of a powerful legislative branch, I actually think goes a long way.
So, I'm going to, just a little time check here. We're going to go about 15 minutes past where we've slotted for this. I want to leave time for, good time for some questions here because a lot has been put on the table. Robert, I was the colleague on the panel that said that conservatives, if not Republicans, tend to run down government. I, in part, was borrowing that famous phrase from a certain activist on tax policy who said once his goal was to make government small enough he could drown it in a bathtub. Didn't say the federal government, didn't say the local government, just said the government. And we all have the 1980 inaugural speech quote from President Reagan, which is often taken out of context about government in this present moment. Government is not the solution to our problems, government is the problem. We've had some discussions here around the difference between limited government and small government. A lot of political rhetoric on the right in particular, which you don't see on the left at all, is about this so-called battle between big government and small government. I've never seen that quantified or understood in a way that we could even be measuring it. If we are measuring it by expenditures and debt, we are obviously not succeeding as conservatives, whether we're talking about the federal government or the state of California. So I wonder if part of our challenge around discussing even government reform is in part related to how either Republicans or conservatives often talk about government, qua government. And I think there is a path forward here as it relates to this difference between limited and small. Limited and energetic was another word that our founders used. I don't hear a lot of conservatives today supporting energetic government at any level. So just to throw out there to the panel, how might, do we think it's a problem how conservatives often discuss government as government without some of these other nuances? And B, how might we, whether it's a problem or not, how might we better talk about it?
I can start us off, Pete. I've become very passionate about this topic this year in the midst of a couple of very contentious fights in Congress. And something that Professor McClay said yesterday in his talk really stuck out to me about how we define what our goals are. You know, is our goal to limit the bad parts of human nature? And I really liked how he phrased it, saying that conservatism is really about having a high regard for human potential and human enterprise. And I think that when we phrase things about, well, our end goal is limiting government, we lose this hopeful, beautiful vision for what we're fighting for. And just to bring it really down to the practical, I'm going to give you a case study about how this kind of played out in the discussions around the Farm Bill this year. So if you followed the Farm Bill and you know about this big piece of legislation, you'll know that 80% of the Farm Bill is actually nutrition policy. These are food stamps, SNAP. 20% are kind of crop insurance, crop subsidies, trade policy for farmers. So it's kind of a misnamed piece of legislation because a lot of it is about welfare policy. And right out the gate, Speaker Paul Ryan decided that our goal for the Farm Bill is to address these pressing needs about how we're not helping harness human potential because 12 million able-bodied childless adults right now are sitting on the sidelines and are not working and are receiving a number of different welfare programs, people who could be working. We're not talking about people with disabilities or with young children or pregnant women or any of that, but people who could be working. And what we talked about in all of the panels this week is the centrality of work to human thriving and to conservatism in this kind of, you know, it's throughout your document and a way forward. And what was frankly very disappointing to me is we're going around selling this piece of legislation that had strong work requirements that would have gotten 6 million people was the estimate into the workforce. 6 million people who've been sitting on the sidelines not working into the workforce in a time in our economy when we have 6.5 million open jobs right now due to the booming economy. And I thought going out the gate that conservatives are going to be so excited for this because this could be transformational for people's lives for generations. What happened in this fight? One conservative group came out strong helping us on it. The rest of the conservative movement said that 20% of the bill that gives, you know, subsidies to farmers, by the way, we're coming out of a 5-year farming recession, you know. Say what you want about the principles of cronyism and all of that. We're coming out of a 5-year farming recession and the majority of Republican constituents felt like they needed that at this time. Maybe it's not the most principled conservative thing. But the majority of the conservative movement said that 20% of the bill is such an egregious affront to our principles of limited government that we can't help you get the 80% across. And that bill failed the first time around. So we did not get the work requirements and we were very frustrated. I sat with a woman who had come in to do a press conference about the bill who had moved from welfare to work through state level policy. And she told me her story about how she was homeless, she was arrested for shoplifting, she was on drugs for the first 10 years of her adult life until she got a job. And then she brought her daughter back in. She got a home, started her own business helping other women get off the street just because she got a job. That's how important a job is. So I watched that bill fail with this woman whose life had been transformed, while I watched the rest of the conservative movement tell me how horrible, I had people yelling at me, telling me how horrible I was for supporting the Farm Bill because conservative principles of limited government were not supported. And that was a light bulb moment to me that what are our priorities? We're not going to get everything in a piece of legislation. It's not going to be the perfect piece of limited government conservative legislation. But if we can do something that transforms people's lives, it has a ripple effect, shouldn't that be the priority over what I call CBO score politics, where we're doing a tally of how much money we're saving in every bill, and that's the litmus test for, is this a conservative priority, CBO score politics? So this has really become kind of a central reason to how I'm starting to prioritize what we do legislatively and tactically, is thinking about this high regard for human potential and enterprise.
Yes.
Can I say something?
Right.
Yeah, so big government, most Americans don't care about this. And a lot of conservatives rhetorically care about it, but they don't care about it. Not really. Excuse me. I mean, I think we've lost a lot in just after the collapse of communism, the notions of big collective state-controlled enterprises and government had it was a very real threat. And when that went away, we've seen, particularly with younger people now, this sense of like that collectivism is this big threat is one problem. But honestly, a lot of older conservatives really don't care about big government either. Right after the Tea Party election in 2011, I pulled with YouGov over the course of a year a panel of 2,400 self-described conservatives. And they had to, when they joined the panel, they had to say whether they were Tea Partiers, Tea Party sympathizers, socially liberal, fiscally conservative. We had these different classifications. And when we would ask things like, we would inform questions like, here's what's actually driving the deficit. It's actually not the part of the budget that the Farm Bill and the other things are paid out of, which is an increasingly shrinking part of the federal pie. It's these middle class entitlements, and like Social Security and Medicare and these things. And we said, what would you support? Certain reforms like Paul Ryan and others are proposing. And when the Tea Partiers who would always say that the biggest problem was runaway government spending, it was interesting how their response to those reforms dropped almost to where the establishmentarians were, like pretty much opposed to tinkering with Medicare and Social Security, which means you're not really serious about big government. And I think what is probably more motivating for people now is the sense that government actually not reach into our lives in ways that it shouldn't. I think across the right and the left, there's a shared sense that an overly intrusive, expansive government is a threat, and that can come in a number of different ways. And then I think that government be responsible for solving problems that it can be responsible for solving. And I think that's why I think we expect too much of the federal government. We expect it to do things that it can't do. There isn't really a national policy that will solve inequality. You can't solve it through the tax code. I mean, you look at what's driving it, this regional variation in economies and all of that stuff, it's going to actually happen by getting underskilled people connected to growing parts of a regional economy. There's really nothing you can do at the national level to solve that. So let's stop expecting our federal government to solve a problem like that, and let's figure out a way for it to happen in a much more decentralized way where people who actually can take responsibility for solving those problems are. So I think government intrusiveness an overly aggressive and hyper-executive branch aided and abetted by an overly weak Congress by its own design over the last 30 years. I think that's an area where I think you could build some support. But I really think it's hard to motivate people on the big government thing, both from the younger side of the generation little scale to the older side.
I think the interesting conundrum that we find ourselves in, and I'll give you two examples of where government really is not working. Puerto Rico, to my knowledge, the whole island of Puerto Rico, I think 60% of it still does not have a working infrastructure. When you take a look, if you remember the images of Katrina, when we just simply could not get this right, and when we saw, you juxtapose that when we saw companies like Walmart and eBay and Amazon and FedEx going into New Orleans and Mississippi and so forth and actually doing things much more efficiently than the government ever could. The question becomes, I think in people's minds is, well, what am I getting my money for? And isn't this the basic idea of what government should be, is to help those who can't help themselves, i.e. Puerto Rico and Katrina? And then to your question, Dr. Peterson, in my mind it is, well, who can articulate on our side in a very thoughtful way, a la like a Ronald Reagan or even like a Newt Gingrich, can humanize what we believe in a collective way. And what I mean by that is that we were really blessed, I think, to have Ronald Reagan articulate what the role of government should be from 1980 to, well, prior to that, but when he was president from 1980 to 1989. I think on the left, obviously the Democrats had a really good spokesperson in Bill Clinton. But if you fast forward to now, I don't know, first of all, I don't know who speaks for us. It's not Donald Trump that speaks for us from a conservative standpoint. There is, and this is my earlier point about a weak Congress, I don't know who in the Congress who actually is a thought leader. Where are our Bill Bennetts? Where are our Dick Cheneys? You know, where are our Jack Kemps? Remember Empower America back then? I mean, people that were churning out conservative ideas and that had an alternative view about what the role of government should be and and humanized it in a way that we can all relate to. I think that's the conundrum that we as conservatives find ourselves in.
Yeah. No, I think this is exactly the challenge we have, because in some ways, the far progressive left has decided that they are going to be very clear about what they believe the federal government should and should not be doing. And their vision is much more expansive and much more far-reaching. And if you look at this upset in New York that happened on Tuesday with Joe Crowley losing to this young progressive woman who has no problem being a self-identified socialist and has no problem identifying with that part of the far-left agenda. And you see so much of the politics of 2020 is going to be dictated on the left, in my mind, by that vision. What is our alternative to that?
Yeah.
Now, to date, the alternative has been less government and less involvement of the feds in particular. Okay, that's a fine vision, except it's not really a vision.
Right.
Because there's no alternative there. Is it localism? Are we talking about a community by community, which I think is absolutely the right approach? Are we talking about the involvement of civil society, which we should be? That's not our vision. So the challenge we have is not only is the left, I think, activating around a point of view, and we can talk about whether that's right or wrong. I think most people in this room would agree that it's wrong. But we need to be selling something that people look at and say, hey, that's an acceptable alternative. And to date, I don't think we've done a great job of that. And I think that's the responsibility of folks in Congress, yes, but also thought leadership on the right in general, I think, has fallen off in that.
Well, I mean, that is such a huge point. And the way that strikes me is that the orienting principles for many on the left are government policy, and our responses are always against those. I don't think we've had really a government-related policy set of principles since contract, right? And so here in California, you might know, for those of you not from California, we're in the midst of a gubernatorial race. All the statewide offices are up for election in November. On the left, and this will certainly be a part of the conversations when we all get back to thinking about politics in September and October, the litmus test issue on the left was a single-payer plan for the state of California, which the Legislative Analyst's Office for the state of California evaluated the cost of that bill to be $400 billion, and it passed the legislature. To put that in some context, $400 billion is more than twice the entire annual general fund for the state of California. And that's not high-speed rail, where it's a one-time project. That is year after year after year. Even all that data being available, that did not stop that from getting through the legislature until the Speaker of the Assembly essentially pocket vetoed the bill. That is going to be the litmus test now in California going forward. What is the response then from the right? That's idiotic, ludicrous, but are we getting at the issue undergirding that? Right? Yeah, Tony.
Well, I just wanted to jump in quickly. I think the first thing I wanted to say was probably in response to Rachel about, I mean, the Farm Bill, I think, is sort of a good example of this, where a deliberative debate about whether we should have subsidies for farms, that's a perfectly reasonable policy debate. And you may have your views about that, but it's not a case where the executive is abusing its authority to do something that's not constitutional. I mean, I suppose if you're an extreme enough kind of libertarian, maybe that would be true. But I think for most people, that would be a reasonable policy debate. And to throw that, to push that out of the realm of the political mainstream because it's not about limited government, that's exactly the confusion, I think, that we're talking about. It's an issue of small versus big government that I don't think actually motivates a lot of people very much anymore. And that limited government issue is deeply connected to the problem of the administrative state, because as was said before, there are a lot of things that Congress is doing now that goes unseen. I think that's an important point to make. But if you look at the overall trajectory, this doesn't just go back to Obama, it goes back to the early 1940s. Congress has completely abdicated its constitutional prerogative in the broadest sense of being the primary branch. And I think that the awkwardness for conservatives, and this gets to what we were just talking about, is that at a certain point in time, making a case against government or a critique of big government or however you want to put it, I think it was maybe necessary to be a critic of Congress and to want to shrink government and so on. But in doing that, and even in fact in a lot of the reforms that were attempted to shrink the administrative state, the price that was paid was the capacity for those institutions to actually work and for there to be oversight was gutted. And if you talk to people that study this issue, they'll all tell you that there is even oversight of the administrative state is not possible anymore, much less actually writing laws. So lawmakers rely on lobbyists, they rely on the agencies themselves who rely on lobbyists. So it's this whole space of politics.
Some might call it a swamp.
But this whole space of politics has been depoliticized and put over into this technocratic space. So this, I think, leaves people feeling very, very alienated and helpless. I think the issue of the response, this is where this issue of the response of the right becomes important. Just an anecdote, I was at a bachelor party a few years ago for a good friend of mine.
That was a great start.
And we got into a long argument about Tocqueville, as one does at a bachelor party. And I won't go into the details about the other things that we did, but most of my friends and friends' friends were good Sanders. So this was before the election of Trump. They're Sanders supporters. They were progressive. So this sort of dovetails with our previous panel a little bit, maybe. And I was trying to make the case to them for something a lot like what Ryan was saying earlier. For a Tocquevillian idea of civil society and the importance of local communities as the basis for democracy and so on. Everybody liked the idea. They'd never really heard it except people that had really read Tocqueville. There was a lot of, this may be similar to your experience on campus putting forward the document, the American Project. But the response collectively was, but how do you do this? The only mechanism that can actually effectuate anything is the federal government. What institutions? Name them for me. Try telling people the Rotary Club is going to solve. So there's a real problem that there's been an evacuation of that space, and it's not enough to say, well, we have to shrink the government. There needs to be a positive alternative, and I think that can involve the devolving power back to the states, and must, and limited government, principles of constitutionalism, and so on. But it does require making a positive case for those aspects of government that we
Well,
think
I think actually, I don't know if it's hitting you out here in the audience about this, but it seems like I'm hearing some positive ideas, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we can speak positively about Congress and the federal government through these types of reforms if we're saying that things are getting out of balance between the legislative branch and the other branches, or the legislative branch and the administrative state. We can talk positively, as Ryan has, around the possibilities around localism and maybe a reclaimed or re-envisioned social science and policy making around that. And
Can I interject?
Yeah.
Again, this is controversial. I readily admit
Please.
that. But bringing back or eliminating term limits, professionalizing the congressional staff so that there's not all this turnover, empowering committee chairmen so they can be industry experts. I don't know how many of you actually watched my boss's testimony back in March when he testified before Congress, Mark Zuckerberg, and the level of questions that members of Congress asked them were pretty. Let's put it this way, my 4-year-old nephew knows more about Facebook and social media than some members of Congress. And by the way, this is by a committee chairman who has jurisdiction over technology. There's a fundamental problem where members of Congress are no longer industry experts because of the high turnover, because of the constant fundraising that they have to do, where they're literally just showing up and just winging it. That is fundamentally a problem.
right?
Yeah, I was just going to say, if we're looking for positive alternatives to where we've been, I think a conservatism of connection is a good place to start. And when you look at what is driving people apart, we've talked a lot about polarization, a lot about identity politics, but what's driving people apart, what's kind of new, what we know from the social science compared to 20 years ago, is this radical sort of geographic segregation problem that we have, and that we actually only live among people like ourselves. From our own social class, from our own, and that is probably one of the most important socioeconomic realities of American life now compared to 30 years ago. And because I was just reading this morning, I mean, just like in the 2004 election compared to now, the spread between the winner and the loser in terms of the votes from counties where you saw a lot of no firm formation, totally stagnant economies, a lot of entrepreneurial activity, was like 2%. In the last election, it was like 15. I mean, all the counties where you saw no new firm formation, declining enterprise, all went for Trump. So there's been this real split and this deep sort of sense of separation. And what is actually keeping people from pursuing opportunity, moving across town? Not just moving to another state, but moving across town. It's housing prices. It's a lack of information about where the opportunities actually are. For those of us who went to college and have networks, if you're looking for a new job, you don't usually go online or something. You call someone, you shoot emails to people that you know within your broader network. And you have ways of finding out the best places to go for the person with the background you have. If you're a kid growing up on the east side of San Antonio, Texas, and the best community college is on the west side for getting an associate's degree in electrical engineering, they're having the best job placement opportunities. There's no way to find that out, and that's a crime. You can figure out where to eat on the west side of San Antonio very easily, and find reviews and find a way there and find out when they're open and if they allow dogs and kids. But you can't figure out where's the best place. If I want to get an associate's degree in electrical engineering, where's the best place to do that? There's nobody doing that. So some of these things are actually sort of straightforward. The housing problem is a very real one. Some of the most segregated places by income in this country are very blue places, who rate the lot sizes, and you can't build the buildings this high, and there can only be this many commercial enterprises, and things have to be this far from the road, and nobody can afford a house here. We need more subsidized affordable housing in our community, and I call on Washington to come in here, and the hypocrisy is so evident, it's right there, and the conservatives are like, we are for lower taxes. It's like, go after that issue. Go after that issue. And go after the technology exists to connect people to opportunities, but we have these clunky workforce development systems driven by supposedly decentralized federal policy, but it's actually not. It's very prescriptive in the kinds of things states can actually do. And so the ability to innovate in that space is very low. So we can have a philosophy of inclusion that's about making our communities more diverse, allowing more low-income people to live next to high-income people, allowing more low-income people and minorities to actually be living and working and studying next to our kids in these new places. These things are possible to do, and I don't know why we're not doing it. It's because we haven't had this discussion about connectivity being sort of central to our policy and politics.
Before we go to questions.
Can I just kind of jump in and respectfully disagree with Robert and Tony a little bit on kind of I think we all see similar problems here, and I think what Ryan was getting at that disconnection and local policies. But I think we expect too much out of our members of Congress, and may I put forward that instead maybe we should have a posture of, our members of Congress should have a posture of humility, that they're not our saviors. The member of Congress I work for, I think she's a genius. I think she has an amazing perspective, amazing background. But do I expect her to solve all of Spokane, Washington's problems? No. She's not, like Ryan said, she's not going to be able to go in there and subsidize the housing problems and fix all of these pressing problems that we talked about today. And so I as much as I would like to get paid more as a professional staffer, I actually disagree that amping up our congressional staffers and doing all these process reforms that empower members of Congress and so that they're educated, I don't think our members of Congress are going to fix our data problems and our problems in the tech industry that my boss questioned Mr. Zuckerberg on. I don't think that Congress has the answers to that. I think that the people in our communities, the business leaders, the people who are working, they are going to be the experts in their sectors. So instead, I would posit we need to have a view of humility towards what our politicians will do. And I actually think that conservatives have lost that. The Tea Party came in and said, as soon as we repeal Obamacare, as soon as we repeal Dodd-Frank, then we're going to be all better. I don't think that's a posture of humility, saying that as soon as we get rid of this, then everything's good. We don't have to get to work on fixing the problems in our communities. I think that posture of humility on even what conservative policy can do for people is really important, and matching with, okay, what are we going to do on the ground as individuals, as business leaders, as community leaders to get to work?
Let's open it up to questions. Go ahead.
This is a question for Ryan, but anyone can jump in. First of all, I love what you're going to say about tribalism, but this question isn't about tribalism. It's about the point about civil societies that a lot of us have been talking about and talk about all the time. As you know, Ryan, most of the research shows that if you look at the strength and robustness of civil society across America, it doesn't map out in a red-blue way. For example, in Utah, civil society is really great, but in the former bastions of segregation, which are now red states, civil society is actually pretty terrible. New England, particularly in Massachusetts, civil society is really good, and maybe not in West Virginia. So, given that there's no clear policy dimension to where civil society is strong or not, but there seem to be a lot of cultural and historical dimensions to where civil society is strong or weak. What can policy do to address the defects in civil society?
Yeah, thanks. This is a great question, and I would expect nothing less from you. So you're right, and the way we measure civil society varies to some degree, and I think that what Mike Lee's team and the Social Capital Project's been doing has been very good. I think their indicators are good. So rates of volunteerism, establishments, nonprofit organizations, religious institutions, those sorts of things, voter turnout, all of that. They measure all that and they try to get a sense of where social capital is strong, where civil society is robust. And Penn State's done some of this as well. And you're right. I mean, it doesn't map out in a red-blue way that maybe conservatives would actually like. But I think that what's also true is the way that we actually measure civil society and map it out the way you're talking about. It gets pretty hard at the county level. We have pretty good state level data numbers. When you try to get down to the county level data, it's actually not as perfect or it's not as complete as you would want to feel like you can make these claims with confidence. And so we have to go with history and tradition and what we know about what works. And I would just say two things. One, I think that public policy reforms can actually create incentives for people in communities to work together. And I cited the Welfare Reform Act before as I think the best example of kind of a national policy that was more than just devolution and more than just about requiring work, but this underreported aspect of it, an understudied aspect of it, which I think was perhaps maybe the most important thing, was the way in which responsibility was not placed at the local level for people's movement from welfare into work. And you actually saw communities take this responsibility and make it work. In some places they didn't, and sometimes that was a result of the level of civil society health in the community. Which brings me to my second point, which is to reiterate what I said earlier. We want to avoid abstract tribalism. We also want to avoid nostalgia for localism as well. If social capital and civil society have cratered in a community, the leaders from that community can do what they can to restore it. But I'm not going to tell somebody who's living in isolation and loneliness and doesn't have a lot of opportunities, living around a lot of friends who are bad influences on their kid, that they ought to stick it out and try to help revitalize the local YMCA. I tell them to get the hell out of there and help them do that and make it easier for them to do that. And so I don't think we can be nostalgic about our communities. If they're falling apart, we can do things like support the opportunity zones that were in the tax bill, and I think that's actually good policy, and it's a one-place-based intervention that I think I could support. But the track record of trying to revitalize communities is really tough as a matter of policy. It has to proceed from within the community. If the community's lost that capacity, when you're looking at households and looking at individuals, I think helping them find a place where civil society is stronger and where they have opportunity is the best policy. And so that I've been accused of being sort of anti-communitarian in that view, and I'll own that.
Yes, back here.
Yeah, this is for Robert. First off, I congratulate you. I think it's kind of paradoxical that you're a conservative. You work for Facebook, but that's another story. You mentioned that little story you had about the lady that insisted there were 4 branches of government, and I thought it's kind of interesting. I think that's part of the issue or the problem or whatever you want to call it, is that social media, whatever people see and read, think they should believe. Not to strangle a quote from somebody a long time ago, but I think that's kind of interesting that it was framed in that methodology, and I think it's kind of sad because people are, and somebody else alluded to the fact that a lot of people in Congress are really not even aware of what's going on with the Constitution, how the Constitution reads, and what it's supposed to do and not do. So I think that's all part and parcel of this issue. So I think is anything being, I mean, obviously, I don't see how Facebook is making any adjustments unless they're being forced with their hands tied behind them, but they're not the only culprit.
Adjustments when conservative bias or just fake news or?
In terms of attitude toward, let's say, objective thought.
So that's an interesting question. So there's three things there. One, we are few and far between at Facebook in terms of conservatives. Although I will say, I've never heard anyone at Facebook speak ill will of conservatives. I've never heard that. It may happen, but it's never happened in my presence. I firmly believe that the executives at my company truly believe in the idealistic notion of connecting people, regardless of your background, regardless of your views. And we bend over backwards. Now sometimes we get it wrong. Don't get me wrong, but we bend over backwards to try to make that happen. I slightly disagree with you that social media is I think social media is part of the problem when it comes to misinformation. I think it's just the internet. You know, there's always been gossip and innuendo ever since the word of mouth. I mean, ever since the Gutenberg press, there's always been tabloids and always been fake news. But clearly, now that almost every person that can afford it has access to the internet, it's obviously multiplied times 50. That's not Facebook's fault. I think that's all of our faults in many, many ways. There used to be a time, as you know, where we had a shared source of truth. Dan Rather, Tom Brokaw, Peter Jennings in the evenings. Now, regardless of their politics, or Walter Cronkite is probably a better example, we all pretty much, how should I phrase this? I'm not sure we all agree with what Walter Cronkite always said, but we trusted what he was saying and thought that he was fairly objective, relatively speaking. We don't have that anymore. If you're asking for a solution in terms of how we get back to that type of normalcy, I don't have an answer for you. But I do think we have to figure this out pretty quickly, because it's becoming, I whispered this to my colleague to my right, your left, we're turning into a culture where we're selecting who we want to be around. We're self-segregating. I have a very good friend of mine who moved to Texas from Northern Virginia a couple of weeks ago, and I said, why did you move to Texas? Because you've always struck me as a very urban person, loving being around diversity. She moved to a place called Waco, Texas. And without even flinching, she goes, you know, Robert, she goes, I just want to be around conservatives. I said, okay, okay, fair. And I said, well, I'm just curious. And she goes, and even before I could ask the second part of the question, she says, you know me. I watch Fox News, I listen to my Rush Limbaugh, and I just need to be around, and I work at a conservative organization I won't name. And I said, but let me ask you, blank. I said, I hear you, and I agree with most of what you're saying in terms of being around conservative, or wanting to be around conservative thought, but how do you, through deductive reasoning, through testing your own thesis, how do you get other information just beyond what we say? And she goes, well, why would I want to do that? That was very telling to me, where there's no incentive to think outside the box, where you don't want your thesis to be tested, where there isn't a natural curiosity to think of, well, what does the other side have to say about this or think about this? That isn't compromising your beliefs, but it is, quite frankly, just saying, well, what are your thoughts around this? I think that's where we have a major problem, and I don't have a solution.
But the statement you just mentioned is very dominant on the left side, more so than the right.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to entertain any other thought process.
Mm-hmm.
That's why everybody should be looking at Real Clear Policy. You know, and if you haven't looked at that site, the way that they lay out the news articles and essays that they aggregate is almost exactly doing point counterpoint down on even particular issues. So I think that really is one of the ways that we can expose ourselves as conservatives or progressives to other points of view, because this big sort that Ryan is talking about is real. And again, as somebody who lives in the deepest of blue People's Republic of Santa Monica, I know there are people that just are not exposed to other points of view. I had people, friends of mine, the other 3 or 4, who had John McCain for president lawn signs set on fire in Santa Monica. I mean, John McCain people. So that is an issue, and I think if there's anything that, well, not anything, one of the things we're trying to accomplish through this American project is to make it more of a discussion on the diversity within the conservative movement as a demonstration of the kinds of conversations that can happen more broadly. We we have time for 2 more questions. Yes.
I fear my question might not have an answer, but I think it's essential to ask the question nonetheless. Governments, economies, relationships are all built upon faith and trust. And in a time where so many of our laws are just being jaw-droppingly ignored by mayors, governors, senators, congressmen, FBI agents, DOJ, IRS, and there is no accountability, prosecution. How do we expect for the society and the community at large to start having, really having any respect or trust or honoring of their own laws?
Tony?
I'll say something that maybe speaks to that. I'm not sure if it answers the question exactly, but something that I was thinking when Ryan earlier said that you have to find a way to make governments, communities, institutions, or I think you mentioned that governments in particular responsible. And I think another aspect is making governments responsive and at various levels, and that includes the federal government. I think a lot of the sort of political alienation is the sense that government is this monolithic thing that is not responsive, and that I think goes to the idea of distrust and feeling like there's no accountability. I think that's why I sort of make this tentative case, for the federal government. I think part of the answer to that has to be to reform our institutions so that, and I'm not saying this would be easy to do, to rebuild trust, so that on the things that we think government can and should do, it's at least trying to do them. And this also gets to something that Rachel mentioned. I certainly don't want to be giving the impression that I think Congress could be our savior or anything remotely resembling that. But I do think that when people look at Congress, they see, and there is an expectations problem, I agree with that as well. I think part of what people see rightly is that Congress, in some cases, isn't even trying. And I think what has to happen is a shift in what our expectations are about success and failure in public policy, especially at the national level. We have a very technocratic, ends-driven view of this. Like Congress isn't getting things done, so Congress is broken. So we lose trust in Congress to be able to do anything to hold executive agencies accountable. But I think that what people are also responding to, which is legitimate, is that Congress should be the place where we're having these debates out. We do have real disagreements in the country within the parties, and there is not a clear sense that, I go back to Congress just because it is in many ways the mechanisms through which a lot of these disagreements are supposed to be mediated. There isn't a sense that Congress is at least making an effort without knowing in advance what the outcome will be to take on these difficult issues like immigration. All of the issues that seem to matter to people at the national level at least are the issues where very little action is done. And I think it's because they're hard and the parties don't agree. And so I've gone a little bit far astray from what motivated your question, but I think that people will start, the hope would be that people could start to have faith in these institutions if they see that they're at least attempting to be responsive rather than suppressing controversy and thinking about re-election.
See, I actually think that government is fairly responsive to what people want in this sense. If you ask Americans about their belief in certain cornerstone values that our nation was built on, the rule of law ranks very low. Many Americans really fundamentally do not that they don't believe in the rule of law, but they don't prioritize it in the same way that they may have used to. There's been a lot of empirical work done on this recently. And so because of that, government institutions are responsive to people's lack of appreciation for the rule of law. So we shouldn't be surprised that institutions of government are not behaving in the way that we would expect or want them to, because in fact people don't really care. And I think that's part of the problem, is that it's more than institutions. It's that the citizenry itself is far less concerned with these matters.
And I would say I know this is not entirely what you're getting at, but we have to be careful not to conflate the intended friction between branches of government as flouting of rule of law. So you talk a little bit about the states. Let's remember, I worked in the states under the Obama presidency. I worked in the states for 4 years on state issue campaigns, and Republicans and conservatives held up Republican attorneys generals that pushed back against Obamacare and against a number of things that the Democratic Congress, Democratic president did. And that's the great thing about federalism and localism, right, is pushing back against certain things. So I think we have to be careful to say that friction isn't a good thing between branches, right? Because we want our states to push back against a lot of what they think the federal government is doing wrong, and that's a good thing. And going through the judiciary on some of those questions, you know, where all the branches are a little bit in conflict, I think that's something we have to preserve, even if we don't like it. That's kind of one of the flip side of federalism, is some states are going to do things we really don't like. Sorry, California.
This is some of the resistance, so enjoy that. Let's go to our last question. Josh.
Next year, I hope we can devote a whole session to Robert's very interesting remarks, which we haven't followed up on, but I think I'm going to raise a question here. Pulling the shades, a little less transparency, the C-SPAN problem. From Plato to Tocqueville, there's an understanding that what the democratic soul desperately wants is complete transparency. And so I'd like to ask the question, can you have a politics that actually works with complete transparency? And I think your answer is no. So what would you do? What would be the small steps? And certainly Facebook and the internet are driving us toward complete transparency. What would you recommend? In order to ratchet it back just a bit, because we're not asking for complete obscurity, but what would you do?
Look, I recognize that what I threw out there is an inherent contradiction. I mean, I forget who said this, but someone said that sunlight is the best disinfectant. And you could make the argument that obviously with the emergence of C-SPAN and social media and so forth, that we know now much more about our government than we ever have. There's no question about that. But at what cost? And I used the example before of the Lewinsky scandal or the impeachment. But you know, again, I want to push back on something that Rachel said a few moments ago, which I think maybe speaks to your larger point, and that is, Congress is barely showing up. You know, I don't expect my member of Congress to fix a pothole in where I'm from in Pennsylvania. That's not his job. That's the mayor's job. Congress' responsibility is to pass the 13 appropriations bills. When is the last time that was done on time? Congress's responsibility is to make sure that there's a check on the executive branch. I think we just had a 45-minute conversation that has been eroding, not just over this administration, meaning the current one, but the previous two. So it's just those little things like that where if, in fact, I believe, if Congress had a little bit more maneuverability behind the scenes to actually, I dare say this, compromise, I dare say this, to maneuver back and forth and maybe do a little bit of horse trading, perhaps maybe we'll have a high-functioning Congress that we had back in the 1970s and 80s and so forth. If you take a look at, and this is just empirical data evidence, if you take a look at the productivity of Congress over the last couple of years and the rise of transparency, all I'm saying is that there's an interesting Venn diagram there. There just simply is.
On the transparency piece, I think that you're right about the detriment that it causes, Robert, and how that has pulled us away from compromise. And I think to your point, I don't have solutions yet, but something that Yuval Levin's been talking about is a rot in all of our institutions, including Congress, that no longer are they character forming, right, where you're trying to solve these big problems together and your number one goal is this kind of character forming institution. All of our institutions have become platforms that individuals use for their own purposes. And I think we see this with the transparency of everybody runs out of any closed door meeting that happens immediately into a press gaggle, right? Everything that you read about what happens in Congress are members of Congress running out of the private closed meetings where they're trying to hammer it out immediately into a press gaggle to tell their side of the story so that they get the broadcast coverage first. And so I think unfortunately, you know, pulling C-SPAN out of the hearings won't change that problem because our incentives have moved to becoming platforms rather than these character forming institutions. So how do we change incentives for members that, you know, getting on broadcast TV, getting the first quote in the newspaper is not the highest best good. The highest best good is passing a piece of legislation that solves problems for the country. And I think that our media, our conservative grassroots groups are unfortunately incentivizing the other platform model.
And we do it better than the left. I recognize that disempowering our leadership, look, when you take a look at the coups that have happened over the last couple of cycles with our Republican speakers, you don't see that on the Democratic side. And I have a theory behind that. My theory is that there's a little bit of fear on the Democratic side. I think people fear Nancy Pelosi. Her politics, that's another conversation. But in terms of the committee chairman, the ranking members on the Democratic side always being in line with respect to less leaks coming out on the Democratic side than on our side, that's telling. Now, I'm not talking about the substance. I'm talking about the tactics.
Ryan, did you have
I was actually going to make some points that Rachel made. So just very briefly, we just reiterate the point that Yuval Levin's been making that she pointed out. And it's got an essay in the current issue of Commentary on Congress being weak for its own fault or resulting from. And I think this performative aspect of the institution is actually a very real problem. So that with the TV cameras gone, which I actually think is probably a good idea. I think given the incentives to be performative, I agree with pretty much everything you said. In fact, and I was going to say, what I was going to end with was I think strengthening the role of committee chairman is very important. I think that the committee chairman having the role of actually being the ones who have expertise in issues, whose job it is to broker agreements, I think is really key. And the fact that committee chairmen have been expected now for several decades to walk lockstep with the leadership and essentially prioritize an agenda that comes from the top, I think it's a huge problem. We need you actually, that's a way to sort of decentralize power within the institution of Congress that makes Congress stronger overall. But this performative aspect, and Yuval's point, which is a good one, it's worth pointing out, is that the founders just assumed that ambitious people would run for office, and they assumed that they would be ambitious for the roles that they were walking into, namely lawmaking and legislating. But now what's happened is ambitious people are running for office, but so they can have platforms to express themselves and express views. And you've got this structure where committees are weak and the leadership's strong, which doesn't really give them the ability to do much more than
like on Facebook. I mean, Congressman, my Ted Lieu is on Facebook every 6 seconds.
That's right. So you're not going to stop people from running out to the cameras after a closed door meeting. They're going to do that anyway. But if you could empower the people in Congress who don't have power to actually take responsibility for problems, that would certainly be a step in the right direction, I think.
Could I add something to that?
Yes, finally.
Very quickly. I agree with increasing a lot of the capacity of Congress, reforming the committee structure. I agree with a lot of that. And I also agree that the incentives are really the issue. I was talking to Yuval about this problem not too long ago. And one of the things that he said was, this is similar to what I was saying about our metrics for success. We shouldn't assume that Congress is failing by their own criteria. In a sense, if what you're trying to do is use Congress as a platform, Congress is doing well in many respects. Like the individual members, they may be able to they're building up their brands in the way that they want. We are evaluating Congress according to different criteria. So that's the problem of ambition. It's the wrong kind of ambition. And the question is, how do you realign the incentives? The thing that I would, this is the final point, I think that the idea that we will address these things by pulling the shade down is misguided. I think from a political perspective, it's probably the worst thing that could happen. If people feel disconnected and alienated from the political process, shutting them out, even if it's well-intentioned, even if it would actually help in many respects, I think will probably not end well. And the related point is practical, is that as Ryan was saying, how many people watch C-SPAN versus follow Trump on Twitter? I mean, I haven't studied these data carefully, but my point is that I don't think that the way that people are brand building, if that's the problem, members of Congress, it's not because of C-SPAN. It's not because roll call votes are public. Supreme Court oral argument can be listened to online. That's not what people tend to do when they engage in a sort of abstract way through social media and television. Those things are going to be there no matter what. We could shut down Twitter, but we're not going to be able to. Well,
they'll use the C-SPAN clips in their campaign clips.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it plays a role. But I think
that's how they use it. Yeah.
But yeah, I'm skeptical on a practical level, and I think politically it would probably be disastrous.
Please join me in thanking our panel.